So, hello there. Recently, I've had a pretty bad obsession with monitors and OLEDs, so I figured let's put all that days of research to good use and share it with people. So, if you've seen YouTube lately or anywhere, there's a lot of hype for new OLEDs coming. And as somebody who's done a lot of research and knows a lot about these things, thanks to the power of autism, I will give you a quick little guide and tell you what I guess I shouldn't say nobody, but a lot of people are mentioning online. So first I'll give you some guides on what to look out for in the terms I'm going to use. And the first is HDR. I can tell you what HDR is, which is increasing the dynamic range, but what matters is how it feels. I describe HDR as removing a gray-silver Vaseline film from front of the display. And what it also does is make highlights, sun shining on the ground from a window and everything feels much more real. It's almost like you can reach inside of the display. Makes everything more poppy and real life, like closer to real life. An SDR, a white wall, and a bulb will have the same kind of RGB values. This is oversimplified, just for the sake of, just an easy explanation. In HDR, the white will remain white like it should, but the bulb will actually shine like a light source. HDR really benefits light sources because they actually don't look like a paint, they look like a light source. So instead of the wall and the white bulb having the exact same RGB values, the bulbs will have the same color, but it will have so much more luminance. And this is why nits is something that we mention a lot in these things. Nits is a measure of brightness. So there's also other differences which technically don't require HDR but usually come with HDR, which is like better color depth, just better color gamut, which means that reds will look so much more red, colors will look much better, and so on. So for HDR we have something called window sizes and their brightness levels. In SDR it's easy to measure brightness, and it's usually the same for most monitors except OLEDs, some OLEDs. With HDR, a lot of these monitors, since they're dealing with such high brightnesses, which we'll talk about more, they have different brightness capabilities, different window sizes. This is due to, from what I understand, fears of burn-in, heat, and power consumption, which can be hard to deal with. Usually these are measured in 1%, 2%, 5%, 10%, 25%, and 50%, and 100%. Out of these, the values that are the most important are 10%, 25%, and then second to that, 50%. 100% are usually not that important. There are very few scenes that you will see can be anywhere near 80%. 50% is more common but rare. 1% is the same. A majority of the scenes, from what I know, fall within 10 to 50%. 100% is something more similar to, browsing the internet and Excel sheet if you're using a white theme. And 1% is, well, the same with a dark theme almost. QD-OLEDs, for example, the monitors that we're talking about here, have an insane 1000 nit for 1%. However, in reality, that's almost never gonna happen. For a good HDR experience, I recommend checking Artings. They have amazing videos. They're not the only one, but they have a real scene measurements, which I really like, which is not, it doesn't give you the whole picture because a real scene quote unquote can differ. But for a good experience, I recommend at least a real scene brightness of 600 nits. And you would need at least 610%, and it's good to have better 50% because they do happen, but being realistic, that just doesn't exist outside of mini LED right now, unless you go with a 55-inch TV. SDR brightness is very different. Anything above 150 nits is not terrible. You ideally want 300 nits, but I honestly use my monitor at 150 nits, so it really depends on you. SDR is usually important for playing games that don't support it, although there are some things such as RTX HDR. And it's important for things such as, just SDR games that are just best played at SDR. You don't want to change the games per se, but most monitors are capable of pretty decent SDR unless your room is very bright, and that's when it starts to come into play. This is very dependent on your environment. Well, in HDR, your environment doesn't matter much, I would say. SDR, it starts mattering more. So you might be wondering, why on earth would I want 1,000 nits plus blasting into my eyeballs? Well, the issue is a misconception from what HDR is. With HDR, obviously 300 nits is too bright for me to stare at, and I don't use it. Unless we're going outside, you definitely not want 1,000 nits. This is why smartphones usually go to 1,000 nits, but laptops are usually around 400, 500. However, when we talk about SDR, that's your entire screen's brightness in a sense. With HDR, when we talk about 1,000 nits, it's only, say, a 2mm radius circle of a reflection in this corner of the display. That is very pleasant and normal to look at. You probably wouldn't want to stare directly, just like in real life, at a very bright reflection, but it's not a problem. It's anything, if anything, a joy to look at. So this is what we talk about. SDR and HDR brightness are very different. 500 nits can be terrible for HDR, but can be amazing for SDR. Color space is something I will admit that I do not understand very well, but from what I understand, it's basically the color gamut at different brightness levels, as some displays, especially WOLEDs, tend to wash out at higher brightness levels, while still producing better colors at lower brightnesses. So let's talk about infinite brightness contrast, which is sometimes a myth. So the contrast on OLEDs is usually great, but for QD-OLEDs, for example, they have a habit of raising the black levels a lot depending on your environment. During daylight, this can be an issue. During the night, you can use bias lighting, and this will still raise the black levels, but it's by such an insignificant amount that you might not even notice. However, during daylight, unless you have blackout curtains, OLEDs can have actually worse black levels than mini LED, which isn't rated at infinite. It's actually much lower. It still can look so much worse. With WOLEDs, it's a different story, but when you see infinite black levels, be cautious, especially with QD-OLEDs. They do not have infinite black levels unless you're in a pitch dark room, and that tends to really bother your eyes, and if it's in the summer, it's hard to get a pitch black room unless it's like 10 p.m. So keep that in mind. QD-OLEDs. These monitors tend to have very poor HDR performance in bright scenes. In dark scenes, they are so beautiful that they will make you cry. If you've ever seen a QD-OLED, you will basically just... they're indescribable in the dark. However, most scenes are brighter scenes. And in brighter scenes, you can see the entire display, from the HUD elements to everything. If you're playing a game, just dim down considerably. And that makes bright daylight scenes, for example, most of Horizon Zero Dawn and a lot of Overwatch, look dead and lifeless and dull, and look actually kind of like it's just you turned off HDR. This is because when there's too much power to give to the display, these things tend to just not be able to do it, so they have to dim everything down. In Horizon, you can counter this by making your room very dim and then reducing the paper white or the overall scene brightness. So this way there's more brightness headroom for the highlights. This for the most part does make it look decent, but it does make it dim, and also not all games support that. For example, Overwatch is a very bad HDR implementation, which makes it hard to fiddle with in this way. However, this isn't ideal, but it's also worth mentioning that compared to a lot of IPS panels, still miles ahead. I would say miles ahead. And bright daylight scenes, they're similar. So it's not like they're worse than a regular IPS panel, but I don't think most people look at OLEDs to get a meh experience, if you know what I'm saying. TVs are a different story. With QD-OLED TVs, they are insane. And pretty much all, I don't want to say all, but most scenes, 99% of the scenes. Also, something worth mentioning with the QD-OLED is that they have insanely fragile coatings. Even a lens cleaning cloth can damage these coatings. They are very hard to take care of, and also the monitors themselves are very fragile, but this is due to poor design of manufacturers focusing on very slim displays. So not much the panel's fault really, but keep that in mind. But the coating on QD-OLEDs is insanely fragile. Even a cleaning cloth can sometimes damage and scratch the display. While on my IPS monitor, I'm literally running my fingers on the display with my nails, and you cannot see a single scratch. If anything, it will improve this crappy coating I have on my IPS panel. My recommendation for QD-OLEDs is bias, and IPS panels is bias lighting. They tend to make your eyes not see the rated black levels because of the bias, and they raise the black levels less. They do still raise it, but far less. So also keep in mind that pitch black is almost non-existent in most real content. So WOLEDs, they don't have some issues as QD-OLED, but they have their own issues, which is color saturation at very bright levels. And keep in mind when we say WOLEDs worse color saturations, we're talking about already two top-of-the-line amazing panels. So worse does not mean bad, it just means not as insanely good. These colors are mostly seen at neon signs, games like Doom Eternal, but keep in mind they're not always common. You would say that things like holograms, light bulbs, neons, fireworks are where you will see these colors and where QD-OLED is capable of producing them. In very dark environments, QD-OLED is generally considered better. However, realistically, most of the content is in a day environment, and also the content in terms of brightness level is a daylight scene for me. Overwatch and Horizon Dawn are something that I would really consider aggressively dimmed on the QD-OLED. A TV like the 42-inch C3 is, in theory, and I haven't tested it properly myself because I don't know one, but I went to Best Buy, if you know what I'm saying, and also did a lot of research. On paper, they're very, very much better. They're brighter, their temperature windows are much better, and you want at least like 600 for a good HDR experience. Anything below 600 is kind of poor HDR, and 600 is good. 1000 is incredible, and above it is just insane. And I don't know if anything above 1500 is even like there's a point to it. If I'm being honest, 1000 is where you get diminishing returns. So if you want something, I would advise taking a look at the TVs. They have lower frame rates, they have their own issues, they can be a pain to deal with, but they have far better brightness performance, although the LG C series tend to have opposite problem in higher brightness contents. They're 50% and 100% is far, far worse. However, those are more rare, but it's almost like personal preference and what you prefer. So although OLED TVs are great, monitors have still such a long way to go. If you're looking at buying one of these, my recommendation is to just wait. You're dropping a lot of money. And I do think 2025 and 2026 is when we'll see a lot of improvement with these things from what I've seen. If you're coming from a Steam Deck, which I am, iPad, tablet, TV, laptops, remember that these panels are leagues ahead of monitors, and even the 42-inch TVs in a lot of ways are far better. So unless you want to get a 55-inch TV, which is not pleasant to use as a monitor in my opinion, I've never tried it, but I can only imagine, I would not go for these. Look, they're still better than IPS for most of the time, unless you have a really fancy IPS. They're mostly, in a lot of contents, still better. They have better contrast, they have better HDR, unless you talk about the bright scenes, which actually IPS can outperform OLED in very bright scenes. It's just a lot of disadvantages. There is a mini LED monitor, and it's only pretty much just one choice. It is from a company called Innocent, but they are not exactly well known or reputable. So yeah, I will show you some examples of where the HDR content will look worse on a QD-OLED. So if I have my Mac, which is my work laptop, and play the Costa Rica scene, which I'll link below, it looks leagues miles ahead on my phone, monitor, and even the Steam Deck, which doesn't have the dimming issues. However, during the famous honey dropping scene in the LG's OLEDs demo, QD-OLED looks insane, and this is where it's so misleading, because most shops and places play those demos, but those demos are really good at making OLED look good, especially the monitors. But during real life use, those things are rare. So my advice is to pass on these and just wait a little bit. Or if you really want something, maybe take a look at the TVs. Another quick thing that I thought I mentioned was burn-in. If you're using this exclusive for productivity or you're not taking precautions, I wouldn't expect it to last more than 2 years. However, if you hide your taskbar, switch windows around every now and then, do everything, I think it would easily last you around 4 years before it starts becoming too noticeable. This is just a guess based on our things, and I highly recommend you to do it. And I based this off the S90C, not the monitors, because they're very new. And yeah, I think this point would be where it starts bugging you. I would not count on them to reliably last more than 3 years without burn-in. And after 5 years, I really think, especially for desktop use, you will definitely experience some burn-in that's annoying. But that's just a guess.